There's a chapter in Scripture that God himself seems to have sealed with unusual power, Matthew 6:30, for verses that have toppled empires, silenced skeptics, and broken chains invisible to the human eye. But here's the mystery most people read. Even miss the earthquake happening beneath the words. In the dusty corner of occupied Palestine, a carpenter speaks and the entire architecture of religion collapses. He doesn't debate the Pharisees. He makes them irrelevant. He doesn't reform prayer. He rewrites it from the ground up, and then he does something strange. He points to something hidden, something most people spend their entire lives searching for without knowing its name. What did Jesus see that day on the mountain? What secret was he unlocking? Why do these specific words carry a weight that 2,000 years haven't diminished? Here's what haunts me. This chapter contains a door. On one side, religion as performance, anxiety as lifestyle, and treasure that rots. On the other side, a room where God waits in secret, a prayer that bends reality, and a kingdom that makes everything else look like shadows. The question is, are you ready to walk through? Because once you see what's really written in Matthew 6, you can't unsee it, and that changes everything. Jesus had been watching them for months now. Every day in Jerusalem, the same pattern repeated itself. The religious leaders would position themselves at the busiest intersections during peak hours. They'd stand where the most people could see them, and then they begin their performances. These weren't ordinary people trying to live good lives. These were the Pharisees, the religious elite, the spiritual authorities everyone looked up to. They knew the scriptures backward and forward. They could quote every law, every tradition, every rule. But somewhere along the way, something had gone terribly wrong. Worship had become a show. Prayer had become a performance. Giving had become a publicity event. And the worst part, everyone accepted it as normal. This was just how religion worked. If you wanted people to know you were spiritual, you had to make sure they could see it. When someone wealthy decided to give money to the poor, they didn't do it quietly. They'd wait until the synagogue was full or until the streets were crowded. Then they'd make their donation into an event. Sometimes they'd literally have someone blow a trumpet before they gave. The message was unmistakable. Look at me. Look at how generous I am. Look at what a good person I am. Prayer had become the same kind of theater. The Pharisees loved to pray, where everyone could watch. Street corners during busy times were perfect. They'd stand there with their arms raised, voices loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. They'd use elaborate language, long phrases, impressive words. But they weren't really talking to God. They were performing for the crowd. The content of the prayer mattered less than who was listening. Even fasting, something meant to be personal between a person and God, had become public. When religious leaders fasted, they made absolutely sure everyone could tell. They'd stop washing their faces. They'd let their hair get messy. They'd wear torn, dirty clothes. They'd walk around looking as miserable as humanly possible. Why? So people would see them and think, now there's a truly devoted person. Look how much they're suffering for God. Look how spiritual they are. This system had infected everything. The temple courts had become stages. The streets had become runways for spiritual fashion shows. And most people thought this was what genuine devotion looked like. They thought God was impressed by loud prayers and public displays. They thought spiritual maturity meant being seen, being noticed, being praised by others. Jesus saw through all of it. He watched as real connection with God got buried under layers of performance and pretending. He saw people measuring their spiritual worth by applause instead of by actual relationship with God. He saw religious leaders who loved the praise of people more than they loved God himself. And he knew the whole system had to be exposed and replaced. Then Jesus started teaching, and what came out of his mouth must have shocked everyone within hearing distance. In Matthew 6:6, he said something that turned the entire religious system upside down. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. Go into your room, close the door, pray in secret. These words hit like a bomb. Jesus was saying that real prayer, genuine, valuable, meaningful prayer, happens where absolutely no one else can see it. Not on street corners, not in crowded synagogues, not anywhere with an audience, behind a closed door, in a private room, alone with God. Think about what this meant for everything people believed about spirituality. If you pray in secret, you can't collect any praise from other people. There's no crowd to impress, no audience to perform for, no reputation to build. no social credit to gain. The only one present is God, and He already knows your heart anyway. You can't fake it when you're alone. You can't pretend when no one's watching. This wasn't just about changing your physical location. Jesus was attacking the fundamental reason people pray publicly in the first place. When you pray in front of others, there's always a temptation to make yourself sound better than you are, to use fancier words than you normally use, to pray longer than necessary, to say things that will impress the people listening. But when you're alone in your room with the doors shut, all of that falls away. It's just you and God. No performance, no pretending, just honest conversation. The religious leaders must have hated hearing this. Their entire system was built on being visible, on being seen, on being noticed. Jesus was telling people to become invisible, to take the most important thing in their spiritual lives, prayer, and do it where absolutely no human being could watch or evaluate or praise them. He was removing the audience they desperately craved, but Jesus wasn't finished. He went further. He said, "Your Father sees what is done in secret." This was revolutionary. God doesn't need you to advertise your devotion. He doesn't need you to prove yourself in public spaces. He doesn't need witnesses to confirm that you're praying. He's already watching in the hidden places. He's already paying attention when no one else is around. Your secret prayers, the ones no human being will ever know about, matter more to Him than all the public performances combined. This idea of God seeing in secret revealed something crucial about who God actually is. Jesus had already mentioned in verse 6 that the Father sees what is done in secret. Now He was helping people understand what that really meant for their relationship with God. Most fathers in the ancient world were distant figures. They were occupied with work, with business, with public responsibilities, with matters they considered important. They didn't have time to notice every small thing their children did, especially things done privately. A child could be struggling alone in their room, and their father might never know. A child could make sacrifices, could do good things, could face difficulties in private, and it would all go completely unnoticed. But Jesus said, God isn't like earthly fathers. He's not distant. He's not too busy. He's not distracted by more important matters. He's the Father who sees in secret. He notices what happens behind closed doors. He pays attention to prayers whispered in the middle of the night when everyone else is asleep. He sees tears that no one else knows about. He watches small acts of obedience that will never make it into anyone's story or conversation. He sees the real you, not the edited version you showed everyone else. And this is what made it even more powerful. God wasn't just watching like some distant judge keeping score of your mistakes. Jesus called Him Father, a Father who sees, a Father who notices, a Father who cares about what's happening in the hidden parts of your life. This completely changed how people could think about their spiritual lives. You didn't need to be impressive anymore. You didn't need to do big things in front of crowds. You didn't need witnesses to validate your devotion. The most important person in the universe, God Himself, was already watching the small hidden moments. He saw you when you got up early to pray before anyone else woke up. He saw you when you chose to do the right thing even though no one would ever find out. He saw the real you, not the edited version you showed everyone else. And this meant your private devotion mattered to someone who actually loved you, not just to someone evaluating your performance or judging your worthiness. The contrast with the religious system couldn't have been sharper. The Pharisees needed crowds to validate their spirituality. They measured their worth by how many people saw them pray, fast, and give. Their entire sense of spiritual value came from external approval. But Jesus was offering a completely different measurement system. God sees in secret. That meant the truest, most valuable, most real parts of your spiritual life were happening where no other human being would ever witness them. Jesus didn't leave His followers without hope of reward, but the reward He talked about was completely different from what the religious leaders were chasing. At the end of verse 6, He promised something specific. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. The reward comes from the Father, not from people, not from crowds, not from reputation or respect or social standing, from God Himself. And that reward is given specifically for what's done in secret, the exact opposite of what the Pharisees were doing. Jesus had already explained what the religious leaders received for their public performances. Earlier in verse 2, He'd said, "When you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. They have received their reward in full. Those words carried serious weight. The Pharisees got exactly what they were working for. Praise from people, applause, recognition, honor, respect, people thinking highly of them. But that was it. That was the complete and total payment for everything they did. There was nothing else coming. No heavenly reward, no eternal treasure, no lasting approval from God. They traded everything for temporary applause. And they didn't even realize what a terrible deal they made. The reward for secret devotion was fundamentally different. It was an applause that faded as soon as the crowd dispersed. It was a reputation that could be destroyed by one scandal or one piece of gossip. It was reward directly from God, and it lasted. Jesus didn't spell out every detail of what that reward looked like, but the principle was crystal clear. Whatever God gives is infinitely better than what people give, and it doesn't evaporate or disappear. Think about it practically for a moment. When the Pharisee prayed loudly on the street corner, people walking by might think, wow, what a spiritual person. They'd nod approvingly. Maybe they'd mention it to someone else later. Did you see that religious leader praying today? That's devotion. But an hour later, everyone would forget about it and move on to the next thing in their lives. The praise evaporated like morning mist in the sun, and the Pharisee would need to do it all over again tomorrow to get another temporary hit of approval. But when someone prayed in secret, just them and God, no audience, no witnesses, something fundamentally different happened. God saw, God heard, God responded, God moved, God rewarded, and that reward didn't depend on human memory or human opinion. It couldn't be taken away by gossip or scandal or someone else's bad mood. It wasn't tied to your reputation in the community. It was solid, real, permanent, and lasting. Jesus moved from talking about prayer to talking about fasting, and his instructions followed exactly the same revolutionary pattern. In verses 16 to 18, he said, "When you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show others they are fasting. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to others that you are fasting, but only to your Father who is unseen, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you." The hypocrites, and Jesus used that word directly, not softening it at all, made fasting into a public announcement. They deliberately messed up their appearance, unwashed faces covered in dirt or ash, hair that hadn't been combed in days, torn clothing, sad expressions carefully maintained whenever anyone was watching. The entire point was to look miserable so everyone around them would know they were fasting. They wanted people to see their sacrifice and be impressed by their dedication. Jesus called this out as just another form of seeking reward from people instead of from God. These public fasters had already received their reward in full. People saw them, people thought they were spiritual, people gave them respect and admiration. That was the complete and total payment, and nothing else was coming from heaven. Then Jesus gave instructions that must have seemed absolutely bizarre to everyone listening. When you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face. In other words, make yourself look normal. Actually, make yourself look better than normal. Look like you're not fasting at all. Look like nothing unusual is happening. Make it completely impossible for people around you to detect that you're making any sacrifice whatsoever. This instruction stripped away the last remaining reason to fast publicly. If no one could tell you were fasting, you couldn't get any social credit for it. You couldn't build a reputation as a deeply spiritual person. You couldn't use your fasting to climb the religious social ladder. You couldn't collect any praise or admiration or respect. The only one who would know what you were doing was God. And that was exactly Jesus' point. Fasting, like prayer, like giving, was meant to be between you and God, not between you and the watching crowd, not between you and your reputation. When you fast in secret, you're not doing it for applause. You're not doing it to impress anyone. You're doing it because you actually want to draw closer to God. You're doing it because the relationship itself matters to you, not because it makes you look good to other people. The Father who is unseen sees what you're doing in secret. He knows you're fasting even though you've washed your face and put oil on your head. He knows about the sacrifice you're making that no one else will ever notice, or acknowledge, or praise. And he rewards it not with temporary approval that fades away, but with something real, and permanent and lasting. Before Jesus talked about prayer and fasting, he actually started this whole section by addressing giving in verses 2 to 4. He said, "So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you." The image of announcing charitable giving with trumpets might sound like wild exaggeration, but it actually wasn't far from what really happened. Wealthy people in Jesus' day would turn their donations into public spectacles. They give in synagogues during services when everyone was present. They give on busy streets during the most crowded times of day. And yes, there would sometimes be actual announcements, possibly with literal trumpets, or at least with loud public declarations of exactly how much was being given. The goal was crystal clear: honor from others. They wanted everyone to know how generous they were. They wanted a reputation for being charitable, kind, compassionate people who cared about the poor. They wanted respect. They wanted admiration. And they got exactly what they wanted. People honored them. People praised them. People spoke well of them. People respected them as pillars of the community. They received their reward in full. But Jesus said that's all they got. The praise they received in that moment of public giving was the complete and total payment for their generosity. God wasn't adding anything to it. There was no heavenly reward waiting. There was no eternal treasure being stored up. They traded something permanent for something temporary, and they didn't even realize what they'd lost. Then Jesus gave an instruction that sounded almost impossible to follow. When you give to the needy, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. This was obviously hyperbole. Your left hand can't actually be ignorant of what your right hand does, but the meaning was unmistakable. Give so secretly that even you almost forget you did it. Give without keeping score. Give without making mental notes about how generous you're being. Give without any internal commentary about what a good person this makes you. Give so quietly and privately that there's absolutely no possible way to collect praise for it from anyone. This kind of giving happens entirely in secret. No trumpets, no announcements, no public recognition, no witnesses, just you, the person, in need, and God. That's it. Nobody else even knows it happened. And when giving happens in complete secrecy like this, something powerful occurs. The Father, who sees in secret, rewards it. The reward doesn't come from human applause or community reputation. It comes directly from God, and it lasts forever. By the time Jesus finished giving these instructions about giving, praying, and fasting, he had completely demolished the entire religious system of his day. Every single pillar of public devotion had been knocked down. Every method of building spiritual reputation had been exposed as worthless. Every technique for collecting human praise had been called out as settling for the wrong reward entirely. The religious theater that dominated Jerusalem was finished, not because Jesus had banned public worship. He didn't do that, but because he had revealed what it really was underneath all the performance. When you pray to be seen by others, you're not actually praying to God at all. When you fast to impress people with your dedication, you're not really fasting for God. When you give money so others will honor you as generous, you're not giving from a heart that genuinely loves God or cares about people. You're just performing. You're acting. You're putting on a show. And Jesus wasn't interested in reforming the show to make it slightly better or more sincere. He was saying the show itself was fundamentally the problem. The entire concept of public performance as spiritual activity needed to end completely, not just be improved a little bit, not just be done with slightly better motives. It needed to be torn down and replaced entirely with something radically different. What Jesus proposed instead was truly revolutionary for his time and culture. Move everything that matters into secret. Take your prayers behind closed doors, where no one can see or hear. Give so quietly that no one notices or knows. Fast in a way that's completely invisible to everyone around you except God alone. Strip away every single possibility of collecting human praise and focus entirely and exclusively on the Father who sees in secret. This wasn't a minor adjustment to the existing religious system. This wasn't a reform or an improvement. This was tearing down one complete system and building something entirely new in its place. The center of spiritual life was moving from public spaces to private rooms, from visible performance to invisible devotion, from seeking human approval to seeking God alone. The Pharisees had built their entire identity and self-worth on being seen by others. Jesus was telling his followers to become invisible. The Pharisees measured their spiritual value by counting how many people watched them perform religious activities. Jesus was teaching a completely different measurement system, where only God's opinion mattered at all. This wasn't reform. This was revolution. This was the destruction of everything they built and the birth of something entirely new. What Jesus started that day in Matthew 6 became something that would shape the entire course of Christian history for the next 1,000 years. This radical emphasis on secret devotion, on private relationship with God, on hidden obedience that only God sees. This gave birth to what became known as interior Christianity. Before Jesus taught these things, religion was almost entirely external. It was about following rules visible to others. It was about performing rituals that people could observe. It was about being seen doing the right things in the right places at the right times. Your spiritual life was measured and evaluated by what other people could watch and judge. Religion lived on the outside, but Jesus shifted everything inward. He made it about the heart, about what happens when no one's watching, about the relationship with God that exists in secret places where no human eye could see, about transformation that occurs in hidden moments. This was a seismic shift in how people understood what it meant to follow God. This principle echoed powerfully through the following centuries. When the early church faced brutal persecution under Roman emperors, they learned to worship in hidden places, in private homes, in underground catacombs away from any public view. They couldn't perform publicly even if they'd wanted to. They had no choice but to develop interior spiritual lives that didn't depend on crowds or visibility or public recognition. And they discovered firsthand that Jesus was absolutely right. God saw them in secret. God met them in hidden places. God rewarded devotion that no human eye ever witnessed. Their faith grew stronger in the darkness than it had ever been in the light. Centuries later, monastic movements took Jesus' teaching with radical seriousness. Monks and nuns deliberately withdrew from public life entirely to pursue God in solitude and silence. They believed the most important spiritual work happened completely away from the world's eyes in private prayer, in secret devotion, in hidden meditation. They built their entire lives around the single principle that God sees in secret and rewards what's done in hidden places. When the Protestant Reformation exploded across Europe, reformers emphasized personal relationship with God as the core of faith, not relationship mediated by priests or structured by elaborate public rituals, but direct private personal connection between each individual and God. They taught that every single person, not just religious professionals, could go into their room, close the door, and pray directly to the Father who sees in secret. They believed real transformation happened in the interior life of the heart, not just an external religious performance. All of it traced directly back to what Jesus taught that day. On the mountainside, he planted a seed in Matthew chapter 6 that grew into centuries upon centuries of spiritual practice, focused on interior transformation. He showed that the most real, most valuable, most powerful parts of faith happen where no other human being can see them, only God. After Jesus finished teaching about secret devotion, his followers had a question. If prayer was supposed to happen in private behind closed doors away from public performance, how exactly should they pray? What words should they use? What structure should they follow? The religious leaders had their elaborate prayers, long prayers, complicated prayers, prayers filled with impressive phrases designed to sound spiritual and attract attention. But Jesus had just torn down that entire system. He'd exposed it as performance, as theater, as people talking to crowds instead of talking to God. So what was left? His disciples needed something concrete, something they could actually use when they went into their rooms and closed the doors. Jesus gave them exactly what they needed. In verses 9 to 13 of chapter 6, he provided a template. He said, "This then is how you should pray. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one." This wasn't meant to be a mantra that you repeated mindlessly over and over. Jesus wasn't giving them magic words to chant until something supernatural happened. He was showing them a pattern, a structure, a framework for organizing their thoughts when talking to God. This prayer revealed what actually matters in communication with the Father. The original Greek text contains only 66 words. Just 66 words. To cover everything a human being needs to say to God. No elaborate phrases stretching on for paragraphs. No impressive vocabulary that required education to understand. No religious jargon that only trained scholars could interpret. Just simple direct language that a child could understand, remember, and pray. But packed into those 66 words was something remarkable. They encompassed the entire scope of human need and divine provision. Everything a person could possibly need to talk to God about was somehow included in this short prayer. Your relationship with God, God's reputation in the world, God's rule becoming reality on earth, your physical needs for survival, healing in your relationships, protection from temptation, deliverance from evil. It was all there, compact and complete. Jesus was teaching them that prayer didn't need to be complicated or lengthy. It didn't need fancy words or religious language that sounded impressive to other people. It just needed to be honest, direct, and focused on what actually mattered. This template would give structure to their private prayers, helping them know what to talk to God about when they were alone in their rooms with the door closed. The pattern Jesus established wasn't about limiting prayer to these exact words. It was about showing the shape prayer should take. Start with who God is. Move to what God cares about in the world. Then bring your personal needs. Address your relationships. Acknowledge your weakness. Ask for protection and deliverance. This structure kept prayer focused on what was real and important, rather than wandering into religious performance or selfish demands. The very first words of the prayer changed everything about how people could approach God. Jesus told them to start by saying, "Our Father in heaven." These opening words demolished barriers that had existed for centuries between people and God. Notice the first word, "Our," not "my." Jesus was creating community right from the beginning of the prayer. When you pray these words, you're not approaching God alone. You're joining with everyone else who calls God Father. The richest person in Jerusalem and the poorest beggar on the street both say the same words, "Our Father." The most educated scholar who'd spent his life studying Scripture and the illiterate farmer who couldn't read a single word both approached God the same way. There's no hierarchy here, no levels of access, no VIP section for special people. Everyone comes to God as part of the same family with equal standing, equal access, equal relationship. This must have been shocking to people who lived in a society obsessed with social hierarchy. Everything in their world was about level, ranks, classes, divisions. Priests were above regular people. Religious leaders were above common folks. Rich were above poor. Educated were above uneducated. Men were above women. Free were above slaves. The entire social structure was built on maintaining these divisions. Jesus shattered all of it with one word, "Our." We all approached God together, as equals, as family. But even more revolutionary was the word Father itself. Most Jewish prayers in Jesus' day used formal titles for God: Lord, King, Master, Almighty, Holy One. These were titles that created distance, that emphasized God's power and authority and transcendence. They were titles you'd use for someone far above you, someone you never dared to approach casually or familiarly. They put God in a category completely separate from human beings. Jesus gave them a family word instead, Father, not a formal title, not a designation of rank or power, a relationship word, an intimate word. This was how a child would address a parent. It was personal language, close language, language that assumed connection and care and belonging. This single word changed the entire foundation of prayer. You're not approaching a distant monarch who might or might not grant you an audience if you use the right protocol. You're not pleading with an impersonal cosmic force that doesn't know your name or care about your life. You're not trying to get the attention of a busy, distracted deity who has more important things to deal with. You're talking to your Father, someone who knows you personally, someone who cares about you specifically, someone who wants to hear from you and wants to respond to you. The word Father suggested access. You can come close without fear. It suggested affection. You are loved, not just tolerated. It suggested belonging. You are part of the family, not an outsider begging for scraps. It suggested security. You have a Father who provides and protects. It suggested relationship. This isn't about religious duty or obligation. It's about family connection. But Jesus didn't stop there. He added, in heaven. This phrase kept the balance. Yes, God is your Father, intimate, close, caring, personal. But He's also in heaven, powerful, holy, transcendent. sovereign. He's not just a buddy or a peer or a friend on your same level. He's not domesticated or controllable or limited to human categories. He's your Father who rules from heaven. The combination created perfect balance. Close enough to care about your daily bread, powerful enough to actually provide it, intimate enough to hear your whispered prayers, mighty enough to change reality in response to them. The first request in the prayer came immediately after addressing God as Father. Jesus taught them to pray, "Hallowed be your name." At first glance, this might seem like just reverent religious language, the kind of formal phrase people use to sound spiritual, but it was actually a specific, urgent request about something that mattered deeply to God's purposes in the world. The word hallowed means to be treated as holy, to be honored as sacred, to be respected and revered for what it truly is. Jesus was teaching them to pray that God's name, His reputation, His character, His identity, who He really is, would be treated as holy throughout the world. This prayer was necessary because God's name had been profaned throughout history. Religious people who claimed to represent God had acted in ways that made God look bad to the watching world. Hypocrites who talked constantly about God while living selfishly and treating others cruelly made people think God didn't care about justice or mercy. Corrupt leaders who used God's name to gain power and exploit the vulnerable made people think God was just another tool for human ambition and greed. False prophets who claimed to speak for God while lying for their own benefit made people think God couldn't be trusted. The result was that people across the world had wrong ideas about who God actually was. They thought God was angry and cruel because religious people who claimed to follow Him were angry and cruel. They thought God was hypocritical because people who talked about God were hypocritical. They thought God was distant and uncaring because the religious establishment was distant and uncaring. God's name, His reputation, His character had been dragged through the mud by the very people who claimed to represent Him. When Jesus taught His followers to pray, "Hallowed be your name," He was teaching them to pray for God's reputation to be restored on earth. He was teaching them to ask that people would see God as He really is, not the distorted version created by religious hypocrisy and human wickedness. He was teaching them to pray that God's true character would become visible in the world. This prayer was asking that God's actual nature would be revealed and recognized, that when people heard God's name, they would think of His real attributes, His holiness that can't tolerate evil, His love that relentlessly pursues the lost, His justice that defends the oppressed and confronts oppressors, His mercy that forgives truly repentant hearts, His faithfulness that keeps every promise. The prayer was asking that God Himself would act in ways that would reveal who He really is to a world that had forgotten or never known. This wasn't a passive prayer. It was asking God to actively restore His reputation, to demonstrate His character, to show Himself to the world in ways that would make His holiness, His love, His justice, His mercy undeniable. The next line of the prayer was even more loaded with dangerous implications. Jesus taught them to pray, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." These words were politically explosive in first-century Palestine, and everyone listening would have understood exactly what they meant. The land where Jesus was teaching was occupied territory. Rome ruled with absolute power. Roman governors made the laws. Roman soldiers enforced those laws with brutal efficiency. Roman taxes drained the economy. Roman authority controlled every aspect of public life. And Rome did not tolerate anyone who talked about a different kingdom, a different king, a different way of organizing society and wielding power. That kind of talk was treason. That kind of talk got you arrested, tortured, and executed. But Jesus taught His followers to pray for exactly that. Your kingdom come, God's kingdom, God's rule, God's reign, God's way of doing things, replacing the way things were currently done. This was a prayer asking for God's direct governance to replace all earthly governments and human power structures, every empire, every kingdom, every human authority exercising control. The prayer was explicitly asking for all of it to be overthrown and replaced by God's direct rule. This wasn't metaphorical language. This wasn't spiritualizing political realities in a harmless religious sentiment. This was a direct request for regime change on a cosmic scale. The prayer was asking God to establish His kingdom on earth, which necessarily meant displacing every other kingdom currently claiming authority. And this wasn't escapist theology about someday leaving earth behind and going to heaven after you die. The prayer specifically said on earth as it is in heaven. Jesus was teaching them to pray for God's will to be implemented here now, in human history in the physical world where they actually lived. He was teaching them to pray for heaven's reality, to invade and transform earth's reality. Think about what happens in heaven. In heaven, God's will is done perfectly, immediately, and completely. There's no rebellion against God's purposes. There's no resistance to God's commands. There's no opposition to God's plans. What God wants happens instantly and fully. Heaven operates according to God's principles, God's values, God's justice, God's love. Heaven functions the way God designed reality to function. The prayer was asking for that same reality to come to earth, for God's will to be done here the way it's already done there, for earth to start operating according to heaven's principles instead of human selfishness, greed, violence, and lust for power, for God's justice to become reality in human courts, for God's love to become visible in human relationships, for God's peace to replace human warfare, for God's truth to replace human lies. This was radical. This was revolutionary. This was a prayer that, if taken seriously and prayed consistently, would put you at odds with every human power structure that existed. You were praying for God's kingdom to come and sweep away all the kingdoms built by human ambition and maintained by human violence. You were praying for God's will to be done, which meant praying against every human agenda that opposed God's purposes. The religious leaders who prayed long public prayers to impress people never prayed anything like this. They were comfortable with the current system because they had status and power within it. But Jesus was teaching his followers to pray for that entire system to be overthrown and replaced with something completely different. God's direct rule. God's will being done on earth exactly as it was already done in heaven. After the massive requests about God's name being honored and God's kingdom coming to earth, the prayer shifted to something much more basic and practical and immediate. Jesus taught them to pray, "Give us today our daily bread." This simple line addressed humanity's most fundamental, most persistent anxiety, physical survival. Will there be enough to eat? Will I have food tomorrow? What about next week, next month, next year? Will my family starve? Will I be able to provide for the people who depend on me? These fears drove so much of human behavior in Jesus' day, and they still drive human behavior now. People hoarded resources because they didn't trust there would be more available later. People competed ruthlessly for wealth and possessions because they thought someone else having enough meant they wouldn't have enough. People lied, cheated, exploited, and hurt others to secure their economic future. The fear of not having enough controlled entire lives, shaped whole societies, and caused endless suffering and conflict. Jesus attacked that fear directly by teaching them to ask for daily bread, not monthly bread, not yearly bread, not enough, bread to last a lifetime, not a warehouse full of bread stockpiled against future uncertainty. Just today's bread, just enough for right now, just what they needed to make it through the current day. This was completely deliberate. By instructing them to ask only for today's provision, Jesus was teaching them to live in a radically different way than everyone around them. He was teaching them to practice trust instead of accumulation. He was teaching them to depend on God daily instead of depending on their own ability to hoard resources. He was teaching them that security comes from relationship with the Father who provides, not from piling up possessions to protect themselves against the future. The request for daily bread assumed something crucial, that you would pray this prayer again tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that, every single day. You'd come back to your Father and ask for that day's bread. You wouldn't ask once and expect God to dump a lifetime supply at your feet. You'd ask daily, creating a rhythm of ongoing dependence, ongoing trust, ongoing relationship. This daily asking kept you connected to God. It kept you aware that everything you had came from Him. It kept you from the illusion of self-sufficiency that wealth creates. When you have enough stored up for years, it's easy to forget about God, to think you don't need Him anymore because you've taken care of yourself. But when you're asking daily for daily bread, you stay conscious of your dependence. You stay connected to the source. You stay in relationship with the Father who provides. The hoarding mentality said, "I need to get as much as possible right now and store it up because I can't trust that there will be more available later. I have to secure my own future because no one else will do it for me." This mentality led to anxiety, to competition, to greed, to the wealthy accumulating more and more while the poor went without. It led to economic systems built on fear and scarcity thinking. The daily bread mentality said something completely different. I can trust my Father to provide what I need today, and I can trust Him to do the same tomorrow and the next day and every day after that. I don't need to hoard. I don't need to grab everything I can get. I don't need to secure the next 50 years right now. I can live in daily trust, asking daily for daily provision. This mentality led to contentment, to generosity, to freedom from the anxiety that poisoned so many lives. Jesus was teaching an economic revolution packaged in 7 simple words. Give us today our daily bread. Trust God for today. Do it again tomorrow. Stop trying to control and secure the future. Stop hoarding. Stop competing as if there isn't enough to go around. Start living in daily dependence on a Father who sees you, knows your needs, and provides. The next line in the prayer was perhaps the most personally challenging of all the requests. Jesus taught them to pray and forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. This line introduced a shocking condition directly into the prayer template. God's forgiveness flows to people who forgive others. This wasn't presented as a nice suggestion or a helpful principle to consider. Jesus was teaching that forgiveness operates according to a specific economy. You receive what you give. You experience from God what you practice toward others. The word debts here referred to wrongs, offenses, sins, injuries, all the ways people hurt each other and damage relationships. In the transactional world of first-century Palestine, there was a real and serious thing. People borrowed money and owed it back. But Jesus was using the concept to talk about something bigger than financial obligations. He was talking about the moral and relational debts. People owed each other. Everyone owed debts to others. Everyone had hurt someone, offended someone, wronged someone, damaged some relationship, and everyone was owed debts by others. Everyone had been hurt, offended, wronged, damaged by someone else's actions. This was universal human experience. We've all been on both sides, the one who hurt and the one who got hurt. The question was what to do with those debts. How do you handle it when someone owes you because they hurt you? How do you respond when someone has wronged you and can never fully make it right? The religious system of Jesus' day had elaborate rules about keeping track of wrongs and demanding payment. Justice meant making sure people got exactly what they deserved. If someone hurt you, the right thing to do was hurt them back in equal measure. If someone took from you, you took from them. The debts had to be paid one way or another. Keeping careful records of who owed what to whom was considered righteous. Never forgetting a wrong done to you was considered wise. Jesus introduced a completely different system. Forgive the debts others owe you, and God will forgive the debts you owe Him. Cancel what others owe you, and God will cancel what you owe Him. Release others from their obligation to pay you back for the harm they caused, and God will release you from your obligation to pay Him back for your sins against Him. This created a direct connection between how you treat others and how God treats you. The measure you use in forgiving others becomes the measure God uses. In forgiving you, if you're stingy with forgiveness toward others, God will be stingy with forgiveness toward you. If you're generous with forgiveness toward others, God will be generous with forgiveness toward you. This wasn't about earning God's forgiveness through good behavior, as if you could pile up enough forgiveness of others to purchase God's forgiveness of you. It was about becoming the kind of person who can actually receive forgiveness. The issue was your heart condition, your capacity to absorb grace. An unforgiving heart is a hard heart. When you hold grudges, nurse resentments, keep detailed records of wrongs, and refuse to release people from what they owe you, your heart gradually hardens. It becomes like stone, impenetrable, closed, sealed off, and a hardened heart cannot absorb grace. It's like trying to pour water into a container with the lid screwed on tight. The water just runs off the outside without ever getting in. God's forgiveness is available, but it can't penetrate a heart that's closed and hardened by unforgiveness. Practicing forgiveness keeps the heart soft, open, and receptive. When you forgive others, when you cancel their debts, release them from obligation, let go of your right to pay back, your heart stays tender. It stays capable of receiving grace. It stays open to God's forgiveness flowing in. Jesus was teaching that forgiveness creates a flow, a circulation. As you forgive others, you open yourself to receive God's forgiveness. As you extend mercy to others, you position yourself to experience God's mercy toward you. As you release others from their debts to you, you become able to receive release from your debts to God. But as you close yourself to forgiving others, you simultaneously close yourself to receiving God's forgiveness. The economy of forgiveness requires participation. You can't receive what you refuse to give. Near the end of the prayer, Jesus included a line that acknowledged something most religious people tried desperately to hide. He taught them to pray and lead us not into temptation. This was brutally honest about human weakness and limitation. Most religious teaching in Jesus' day emphasized how strong and capable people could become if they just tried hard enough, followed enough rules, and exercised enough willpower. The Pharisees acted like they were above temptation, like they had conquered all weakness through religious discipline and moral effort. Admitting you were weak, admitting you needed help, admitting you couldn't handle everything on your own. That was seen as spiritual failure, as lack of faith, as evidence you weren't really trying. Jesus taught the exact opposite. He taught them to pray for protection from situations that would exceed their spiritual capacity. He taught them to ask God not to lead them into places where they would be tested beyond what they could endure. He taught them to acknowledge their limitations and ask for divine help in avoiding circumstances they couldn't handle. This was radical humility embedded right in the core prayer template every follower of Jesus would pray. The prayer assumes something important, that you know your limits. You're not strong enough to resist all testing. You can't handle every difficult situation that might come your way. There are temptations that would overwhelm you, and you need God's protection from encountering them. There are tests you would fail, and you need God's guidance to keep you from walking into them. This wasn't about God actively trying to make people fail, or deliberately leading them into situations designed to make them sin. The phrase lead you is not into temptation was asking God to guide their path away from situations where they would likely fall. It was asking for divine wisdom in where they went, what they did, what situations they encountered, what people they spent time with. It was asking God to protect them from their own weaknesses by not allowing them to walk into circumstances they weren't spiritually equipped to handle. Think about what this prayer acknowledged. It said, you're not always aware of where danger lies. You don't always recognize temptation coming. You can't always predict which situations will be too much for you. You need God to guide your steps away from the traps you don't even see. You need divine protection because your own discernment isn't sufficient to keep you safe. Religious pride says I'm strong enough to handle anything that comes my way. I can resist any temptation. I don't need special protection or help. I've got this under control. This prayer says the opposite. I'm weak and I know it. I need you to protect me from my own limitations. I need you to guide me away from situations I can't handle. I need you to lead me not into temptation because if you do lead me there, I'll probably fall. This was radical honesty, radical humility, and Jesus made it a standard part of the prayer template, ensuring that everyone who prayed this way would regularly acknowledge their weakness and ask for divine protection from situations beyond their capacity to resist. The prayer ended with one final request that placed everything in a much larger context. Jesus taught them to pray, but deliver us from the evil one. This closing petition recognized something many people in Jesus' day tried to ignore or explain away. There's a real spiritual enemy actively opposing God's people and God's purposes. Not just abstract evil floating around in the universe, not just human wickedness and bad choices, not just unfortunate circumstances or difficult situations, an actual personal force of evil, a spiritual being working against everything God is trying to accomplish in the world. The religious leaders of Jesus' day generally fell into two opposite errors. When it came to spiritual warfare, some ignored it entirely, acting like evil was nothing more than human weakness or poor decision-making. They didn't believe in any real spiritual opposition. Everything bad that happened was just humans being humans. This perspective made them blind to spiritual realities and vulnerable to spiritual attacks they didn't even recognize were happening. Others saw demons and evil spirits everywhere, blaming spiritual forces for absolutely everything that went wrong. Someone got sick, must be a demon. Someone sinned, demon possession, crops failed. Spiritual attack. They lived in constant superstitious fear, seeing spiritual danger in every shadow. And they made God's people anxious and paranoid rather than confident and secure. Jesus taught a balanced awareness between these two extremes. Evil is real. There's a spiritual enemy. He's called the evil one because he embodies and actively promotes everything that opposes God's character and purposes. He's not a myth. He's not a metaphor. He's not just a personification of abstract evil. He's real. He's active. He's intelligent. He's dangerous. But, and this is the crucial balance, God's deliverance is more powerful than any attack the evil one can launch. The prayer didn't teach them to live in fear of spiritual forces. It taught them to ask for deliverance, to ask for rescue, to ask for protection, to ask for freedom from the evil one's influence, power, and schemes. The assumption was that God could and would deliver them. The enemy was real, but God was more powerful. The prayer asked for deliverance, for rescue, for protection, for freedom from the evil one's work in their lives. This petition acknowledged that following God would inevitably put you in conflict with spiritual forces beyond your natural ability to handle on your own. You would face opposition you couldn't defeat through human strength or wisdom. You would encounter spiritual attacks you couldn't even perceive with physical senses. You needed divine deliverance from an enemy who was real, active, and stronger than you were. This final line of the prayer placed every believer's daily struggles within a cosmic context. You're not just dealing with personal problems or human difficulties. You're not just trying to be a better person or make good choices. You're living in the middle of an ongoing conflict between good and evil, between God and his enemy, between the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of darkness. Your daily life, the temptations you face, the struggles you endure, the choices you make, the battles you fight, all of it connects to this larger spiritual reality. The prayer that started with our Father in heaven ended with "Deliver us from the evil one," from intimate family relationship with God to cosmic spiritual warfare, from daily bread to deliverance from demonic evil, from personal forgiveness to protection from spiritual attack. The entire scope of human existence, the full range of realities believers would face, compressed into a simple prayer template that anyone could pray behind closed doors. In their private room, Jesus had given them everything they needed to restructure their reality through prayer. After teaching his followers how to pray, Jesus moved to a subject that controlled more of human life than most people wanted to admit: treasure, where you put your resources, what you do with what you have, how you think about wealth and security in the future. In verses 19 and 20, Jesus laid out a choice that every person had to make. He said, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal." Jesus revealed something most people had never considered. There are two treasury systems operating simultaneously, one on earth, one in heaven. Every single action you take, every use of your resources, every investment of your time and energy, all of it deposits into one account or the other. You're constantly making deposits. The question is which treasury you're filling. The earthly treasury was what everyone could see and understand: money in your possession, property with your name on it, goods stored in your house, investments that produced income, wealth that gave you security and status and power. This was what people worked for, fought for, sacrificed for. This was what made you important in society's eyes. But Jesus pointed out something crucial about the earthly treasury: it's vulnerable. Moths can destroy it. Your expensive clothes get eaten by insects and become worthless. Vermin can ruin it. Rodents get into your stored grain and contaminate your food supply. Thieves can steal it. Someone breaks into your house and takes everything you've accumulated. And Jesus could have added more. Fire can burn it. Floods can wash it away. Economic collapse can make it worthless overnight. Death can force you to leave it all behind. This was how people lived when they didn't know God. But Jesus' followers weren't pagans. They knew something the rest of the world didn't know. They had a Father in heaven who was aware of their needs. The phrase, "Your heavenly Father knows that you need them," changed everything. God wasn't ignorant of their situation. He wasn't distant or uncaring or unaware. He knew exactly what they needed to survive. And he was their Father, which meant he cared and would provide. This meant Jesus' followers were called to a completely different way of being in the world. They didn't need to run after material things like pagans did. They didn't need to be driven by survival anxiety. They didn't need to organize their entire existence around accumulating food and clothing and wealth. They could live differently. Because they knew differently, they knew they had a Father who saw their needs and would meet them. This wasn't about passivity or laziness. Jesus wasn't teaching people to sit around doing nothing and wait for food to fall from the sky. He was teaching them to redirect their energy from anxious striving to confident trust. Instead of worry driving them, faith could drive them. Instead of fear of not having enough controlling their decisions, trust in the Father's provision could control their decisions. The contrast was stark. Pagans lived in constant anxiety, running after material security they could never quite achieve. Jesus' followers could live in trust, freed from the anxiety that poisoned pagan existence. Same physical needs, same uncertain world, but completely different internal experience because they knew something pagans didn't know. They had a Father in heaven who knew their needs and cared about them. Then Jesus concluded this entire section with a principle that resolved all the tension and answered all the questions. In verse 33, he said, "But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well." This was the solution. This was how to live free from anxiety about food, drink, and clothing. This was how to store treasure in heaven instead of earth. This was how to serve God instead of money. This was how to keep your eye healthy and your whole body full of light. Seek first God's kingdom and his righteousness. The word first was crucial. Jesus wasn't saying to seek God's kingdom in addition to seeking everything else. He was saying to make it the first priority, the primary pursuit, the organizing principle for your entire life. Put God's kingdom first. Put God's righteousness first. Make these the things you seek before anything else, above anything else, with more energy and focus than anything else. What does it mean to seek God's kingdom? It means wanting God's rule to be reality in your life and in the world. It means organizing your decisions around what advances God's purposes. It means asking how your choices align with what God is doing. It means making God's reign, not your comfort, not your wealth, not your security, the central goal of your existence. What does it mean to seek God's righteousness? It means pursuing the righteous character God has. It means wanting to be like Him. It means choosing what's right according to His standards. It means living in a way that reflects who He is. It means caring about what He cares about: justice, mercy, truth, love. When you seek first God's kingdom and righteousness, something remarkable happens. All these things, food, drink, clothing, everything you were anxious about, will be given to you as well. Not because you earned them, not because you stored up enough earthly treasure to secure them, but because God provides them. They come as a natural result of seeking His kingdom first. This wasn't a prosperity formula. Jesus wasn't promising that seeking God would make you wealthy. He was teaching a priority framework. When you organize your life around God's kingdom and righteousness, when that becomes your first pursuit, your primary focus, your main energy investment, you discover that your needs are met within that framework. You have what you need, not necessarily everything you want, but everything you actually need, and it comes from God, not from your anxious striving and accumulation. This principle unified everything Jesus had taught in chapter 6, private devotion behind closed doors. That was seeking God's kingdom first. Praying the prayer Jesus taught. That was seeking God's kingdom and righteousness, storing treasure in heaven instead of earth. That was seeking God's kingdom first. Serving God instead of money. That was seeking God's kingdom first. Living free from anxiety about material needs. That came from seeking God's kingdom first. Everything converged on this single pursuit. Put God's kingdom and God's righteousness before everything else, and everything else falls into place. If this story opened your eyes to something you'd never seen before in Matthew 6, do the things. First, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next deep dive into Scripture. We're uncovering the revolutionary truths hidden in passages you thought you already knew. Second, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who's trapped in religious performance. Someone who's anxious about their future. Someone who's trying to serve both God and money and wondering why it's not working. Send them this story. It might change their life the same way Matthew 6 has changed millions of lives across 2,000 years. The revolution Jesus started on that mountainside is still happening today, and now you're part of it. This was talking about a specific condition when what you think is light is actually darkness. When you're so deceived that you believe you see clearly while actually being blind. When you call evil good and good evil, thinking you're walking in wisdom while stumbling in complete confusion. This was the worst possible state. It wasn't just being in darkness and knowing it. It was being in darkness while being convinced you were in light. It was being blind while thinking you had perfect vision. People in this condition would lead others into destruction while being absolutely confident they were helping. They'd make catastrophically bad decisions while thinking they were wise. They'd invest everything in worthless things while being certain they were securing their future. The religious leaders of Jesus' day were perfect examples. They were completely confident in their spiritual vision. They thought they saw clearly. They thought they understood God and how to serve Him, but they were actually blind, and their blindness was leading them and everyone who followed them straight to destruction. The light within them was darkness, and the darkness was great beyond measure. Jesus then made a statement that connected everything he'd been teaching about treasure, heart, and vision. In verse 24, he said, "No one can serve two masters, either. You will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." This wasn't a moral suggestion about what people shouldn't try to do. This was a statement of metaphysical impossibility, something that simply cannot happen in reality. Jesus was describing how things actually work, not how he wished they would work. No one can serve two masters. Not shouldn't serve or it's better not to serve. Can't. It's impossible. The structure of reality doesn't allow it, and the reason is built into human nature. A person will inevitably love one master and hate the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. You can't split your loyalty evenly. You can't give equal devotion. One master will win your heart, and the other will lose it. Jesus identified the two masters specifically, God and money. These were the two competing forces for human devotion, and they made exclusive claims. God demands total allegiance. Money demands total allegiance. You can't give both what they demand. You have to choose. Many people tried to serve both. They wanted to follow God, but also accumulate earthly wealth. They wanted to store up heavenly treasure, but also secure their earthly future. They wanted their hearts in heaven, but also anchored to earth. They thought they could split the difference, serve both masters partially, keep their options open. Jesus said that doesn't work. The attempt to serve both God and money doesn't result in divided service. With half your devotion going to each, it results in serving money while pretending to serve God. Because money makes its demands right now. Money requires immediate attention and constant effort. Money is loud and urgent and tangible. And God is often quiet and patient and invisible. So the person trying to serve both ends up giving money their real devotion, while giving God their religious language and Sunday attendance. The attempt to serve both masters always results in serving money and rejecting God, even while the person claims to be serving God. This was exactly what many religious leaders did. They talked about God constantly. They performed religious rituals. They held religious positions. But their actual devotion, their real heart, their genuine service went to money. They'd chosen their master, and it wasn't God, no matter what they claimed. Jesus was forcing a choice. You have to pick God or money, heavenly treasure or earthly treasure. Where your treasure is, your heart will be also, and you can't serve two masters. Choose. After establishing that everyone must choose between God and money, Jesus addressed the practical anxiety that made the choice so difficult. Starting in verse 25, he said, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes?" This was getting to the core issue. Why did people serve money? Why did they store up treasure on earth? Why did they struggle to trust God? Because they were anxious about survival. What if there's not enough food? What if I can't clothe my family? What if disaster strikes and I have nothing saved up? These worries drove everything. Jesus called it out directly. Don't worry about your life. Don't be anxious about food or drink or clothing. These words must have sounded almost offensive to people who live on the edge of survival, who didn't know where next week's food would come from, who watched their children go hungry when crops failed. But Jesus wasn't being insensitive. He was attacking the anxiety itself, showing why it was both unnecessary and destructive. He started with a simple observation. Life is more than food, and the body is more than clothes. God gave you life itself. God created your body. If He gave you the greater things, life and body, why would He withhold the lesser things, food and clothes? The one who gave you existence can certainly provide what existence requires. Then in verse 26, Jesus pointed to birds. Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Birds don't farm. They don't harvest crops. They don't build warehouses to store food for the future. They don't have retirement plans or savings accounts, and yet they eat every day. God feeds them. They trust the provision that comes, and it comes. And Jesus asked the obvious question. If God feeds birds, creatures with no eternal significance, who don't bear His image, who can't have relationship with Him, how much more will he feed you? You're infinitely more valuable to God than birds are. If he provides for them, he'll certainly provide for you. Then in verse 27, Jesus asked a question that exposed the futility of anxiety. Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? The answer was obvious. No, worrying accomplishes nothing. It doesn't increase your lifespan. It doesn't solve problems. It doesn't provide food or create security. It just makes you miserable while you wait to see what happens. In verses 28 to 30, Jesus used flowers to make the same point. And why do you worry about clothes? See how the flowers of the field grow. They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? Flowers don't work to create their beauty. They don't weave fabric or design clothes. They just grow. And God makes them more beautiful than the richest king in Israel's history ever managed to look, and flowers are temporary. Grass that's here today and burned as fuel tomorrow. If God puts that much care into clothing something temporary and relatively worthless, how much more will he provide for you, you who are eternal, valuable, made in his image? Then Jesus identified what worry really is in that phrase, you of little faith. He was saying that anxiety reveals a deeper problem. Worry is practical atheism. It's living as if God doesn't exist or doesn't care. It's acting like you're on your own, like you have to secure your own survival because no one else will do it. Faith says God will provide. Worry says he won't or can't or doesn't care enough to bother. Jesus continued addressing anxiety. In verses 31 and 32, he said, "So do not worry, saying, 'What shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear?' For the pagans run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them." Jesus identified worry as characteristic of pagans, the Gentiles, the people who lived without knowledge of God. They ran after food, drink, and clothing, because they didn't know there was a Father in heaven who saw them and cared about their needs. They had to chase these things desperately because they thought they were alone in the universe, responsible for their own survival with no divine help coming. That was the pagan way of living, running after material needs, being driven by anxiety about survival, organizing entire lives around the pursuit of food, drink, clothing, and security, working themselves to exhaustion, trying to accumulate enough to feel safe. The earthly treasury is temporary and insecure. You can spend your entire life filling it and lose everything in a moment. You can sacrifice your health, your relationships, your integrity to accumulate wealth on earth, and it can all disappear before you die. And even if you manage to keep it until your last breath, you can't take any of it with you. The earthly treasury has a maximum lifespan, the length of your life on earth. After that, it belongs to someone else or to no one at all. Jesus presented an alternative, a heavenly treasury. This wasn't something people could see or touch or measure with earthly accounting, but it was real. More real, actually, than the earthly treasury that seemed so solid and important. The heavenly treasury had completely different characteristics. Moss and vermin don't destroy it. It's not made of materials that decay or rot. Thieves don't break in and steal it. It's not kept in a location where someone with a crowbar and bad intentions can take it from you. It's eternally secure. Nothing can damage it. No one can take it from you. Economic collapse in the earthly system has zero effect on your heavenly account, and death doesn't force you to abandon it. It's precisely at death that you gain access to what you've stored there. Jesus was teaching that every person operates within both systems. You're making deposits all the time. The choice isn't whether to store up treasure. Everyone stores up treasure. The choice is where, earth or heaven, and that choice determines everything else about your life. Jesus didn't leave people wondering why this choice about treasure location mattered so much. In verse 21, he explained the principle that makes treasure location the most important decision a person can make. He said, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." This wasn't moral instruction. Jesus wasn't telling people what they should do. He was describing what actually happens, what always happens, what cannot happen. This was psychological observation about how human beings work. Your heart follows your treasure always, without exception. Where you put your treasure determines where your heart goes. This is a law of human nature as reliable as gravity. You become obsessed with whatever you've invested in. You think about it constantly, you care about it deeply, you protect it fiercely. Your treasure location determines your love location. Think about how this works practically. If you store up treasure on earth, if you invest all your resources, time, and energy into accumulating earthly wealth, your heart will be anchored to earth. You'll think about your possessions constantly. You'll worry about them. You'll spend your mental and emotional energy on protecting them, growing them, using them. Your heart will be tied to earthly things because that's where your treasure is. Your conversations will revolve around earthly wealth. Your decisions will be driven by how they affect your earthly treasury. Your relationships will be evaluated based on how they help or hinder your accumulation of earthly treasure. Your values will be shaped by the earthly system because your heart is located where your treasure is located. But if you store up treasure in heaven, if you invest your resources, time, and energy in ways that make deposits in the heavenly treasury, your heart will be oriented toward heaven. You'll think about eternal things. You'll care about what God cares about. You'll spend your mental and emotional energy on what has eternal value. Your heart will be tied to heavenly realities because that's where your treasure is. Jesus was revealing a profound truth about how to change your heart. Most people think you need to change your heart first, and then your behavior will follow. But Jesus taught the opposite sequence. Change where you put your treasure, and your heart will follow. Make deposits in heaven, and your heart will orient toward heaven. The treasure comes first. The heart follows automatically. This explained why wealthy people had such a hard time entering God's kingdom. It wasn't that money itself was evil. It was that they'd stored up massive treasure on earth, and their hearts had followed that treasure. Their hearts were completely anchored to earthly things. They couldn't care about heaven because they'd invested everything in earth. Their treasure location had determined their heart location, and their hearts were nowhere near God. By choosing where to store treasure, people were actually choosing what they would love and serve. It happened automatically, without them even realizing it. The investment came first. The heart followed, and wherever the heart went, the whole person went. Treasure location determined everything. Jesus then shifted to what seemed like a completely different subject, but it connected directly to what he just taught about treasure. In verses 22 and 23, he said, "The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light." This was metaphor, but the meaning was clear. Jesus was talking about how you see the world. Your eye, your way of perceiving reality, your lens for understanding what matters and what doesn't, functions like a lamp for your entire life. If the lamp works properly, everything is illuminated. You can see clearly. You understand what's real and what's false, what's valuable and what's worthless, what leads to life and what leads to death. A healthy eye means clear vision. It means you see things as they actually are, not as you wish they were or as culture tells you they are. You see through deception. You recognize truth. You can distinguish between what has real value and what only appears valuable. When your eye is healthy, your whole body, your whole life, your whole way of being in the world is full of light. You walk in understanding. You make good decisions. You invest in what actually matters. That's connected directly to the teaching about treasure. How you see determines where you store treasure. If your eye is healthy, you see that earthly treasure is temporary and vulnerable. You see that moths destroy it, vermin ruin it, thieves steal it. You see that it can't follow you past death. You see that investing everything in earth is foolish because earth can't hold treasure securely, and you see that heavenly treasure is eternal and secure. You see that nothing can damage it or take it from you. You see that it's the only investment that lasts forever. When your eye is healthy, you naturally store treasure in heaven because you can see clearly which treasury system actually works. The healthy eye sees God as he really is. It sees his character, his promises, his faithfulness. It sees that he can be trusted. It sees that serving him leads to life. The healthy eye sees through the lies culture tells about what brings satisfaction and security. It recognizes that accumulating earthly wealth doesn't produce the happiness it promises. It sees clearly, but Jesus didn't stop with the positive side. He immediately addressed what happens when the eye isn't healthy. In the second half of verse 23, he said, "But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness?" An unhealthy eye means distorted vision. You see things wrong. You believe lies. You think what's worthless has value, and what has real value is worthless. Your perception of reality is completely backwards, and when your way of seeing is broken, your whole life, your whole body, as Jesus put it, is full of darkness. You walk in confusion. You make destructive decisions. You invest in things that can't deliver what you think they will. The unhealthy eye sees earthly treasure as secure and valuable. It can't perceive the moths and vermin and thieves waiting to destroy it. It can't see past death to recognize that earthly treasure has a shelf life. It believes the lie that accumulating wealth will bring security and satisfaction and meaning. And so it drives the person to store up treasure on earth, which means their heart follows to earth, which means their whole life becomes oriented around temporary, vulnerable, ultimately worthless things. The unhealthy eye sees God as distant, unreliable, or irrelevant. It doesn't perceive his character or trust his promises. It can't see that serving him leads to life. It looks at the choice between earthly treasure and heavenly treasure and chooses earth every time, because it genuinely can't see that heaven offers anything better. Then Jesus said something chilling. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness?